we started off kind of asking the same thing. So can you tell us what made you decide to become an attorney? Like what inspired you to become a lawyer? And tell us about your law school experience.
Well, my father was a lawyer, which I guess is probably something that you hear a lot from women who become attorneys, maybe men too. But having seen up close and personal, my mother was a school teacher, and my mother found less satisfaction in her career than my father found in his. He came home talking about things that made him feel good about his practice, and I just grew up thinking, well, that was a wonderful way to live. And so it just seemed like the thing to do to become a lawyer. So from the time I was 13, that was my plan. As for law school, I went to UNC. Again, my father, who was my best friend and advisor, advised that he went to Wake Forest, and as did all of his sisters and his father and uncles. But he wanted me to go to Carolina, and the reason was that as a woman, he thought that it would be harder for me. And indeed, there were 5 women in my class in law school, and I think there were maybe 3 women in Wake County practicing law when I got here. And he thought having a bigger network would be a great asset, and if I went to Carolina, I would have that bigger network. Of course, I came here, and some of the folks in my network were like Robert McMillan. I think Robert went to Wake Forest and Carolina, but he was a part of my network.
And so what year was that you finished law school?
I finished law school in 1971.
And you had how many women in that class?
There were 5 of us.
Out of how many?
I don't know, and it's funny because it was the Vietnam War was going on when we started in 68, so the folks I started with weren't the same folks I finished with, because people kind of came and went as they took care of military service, and mostly people coming back. And so I don't know if I ever knew how many were in the class. At least, I don't know, 180 to 200, but that's just a guess. It may have been more.
And describe that group of 5 women.
I'm sorry?
Describe that group of five women and you guys together. Were you kind of in it together?
Well, no, not really. I would have been. In fact, I sort of gelled with some of the women in the classes after me, and we lived together, in fact. But the women who were actually in my class somehow never really came together. Maybe in those days, becoming a lawyer meant that you were sort of a loner to start with.
So describe your career path. So you finished at Carolina Law in 1971. Take us on your career path from there.
Well, in the summer between my second year of law school and my third year of law school, I was an intern in the Attorney General's office, and Robert Morgan was the Attorney General then, and he had campaigned on lots of things that he wanted to do, mostly consumer protection. But in those days, all of the state's legal business, that is representing state agencies and just the state generally and any legal issues that arose, private practitioners were hired. Robert Morgan had the idea that it would be a better practice to do it in-house. And so he was trying to develop the legal staff. And so there were actually 10 of us hired, which they didn't do again, but that one summer, in November of my third year of law school, I was offered a job in the Attorney General's office. I took it, started on September the 1st, 1971, and I can remember thinking, I don't think I can do this for 30 years. My office was this horrible, because they weren't prepared for that many new lawyers. And we were in a basement room in the Justice Building, 3 of us in one horrible office, sharing an office. We could hear each other's phone calls. And I thought, I can't do this for 30 years. 39 years later, they practically had to drag me out of there, kicking and screaming. Somewhere along the line, I realized this was what I wanted to be and what I wanted to do.
So, 39 years at the
And the Attorney General's office.
Attorney General's office, and when you look back in the AG's office for over those years, take us through the changes that you saw.
Well, I worked for 6 different attorneys general, and went through the first 2 Republican governors, and those transitions were fascinating because every governor who came in had ideas about how he wanted to run state government, and every attorney general who came in had ideas about how he wanted to run the office. So, and of course, times just changed. Obviously, that you're going back way over 50 years, so it covers a lot of territory. But there were lots of changes. The Attorney General in those days, Robert Morgan, as I say, he wanted to do a lot of consumer protection, and so he talked about the fact that, and he advertised that we were the people's lawyers. Well, a lot of people thought that meant that we were the free lawyers, so we got a lot of calls and letters from people who we had to explain to that, no, we were there to actually represent you through the government agencies. But we tried to help people as much as we could. But it wouldn't have been possible but the staff grew. By the time we left, and I was the head of one of the divisions, and in my division there were 80 lawyers. I had well over 100 staff in my division, and of course that grew from 3 or 4 lawyers doing the things that all those 80-some lawyers were doing eventually. So it really changed.
And keeping on the topic of change, in Wake County, in your 39 years of practice, describe the change in the legal landscape in Wake County as a whole.
Well, the legal landscape, just like the landscape generally, has changed dramatically. Raleigh, when I came here, would have been way under 100,000 people. And matter of fact, I recently took a trip to Arkansas, to Little Rock, and Little Rock is now like 200,000. So it has a small town feel as opposed to Raleigh. And I know Wake County's population is well over 1 million people, so we have a much more urban feel all the changes that go along with that. Legally, it's just a bar that started out small. Everybody knew each other. I would walk along the street at lunchtime and always see lawyers that I knew, particularly when I got close to the courthouse, which was on Fayetteville Street at the time. And I would, as I say, speak to Robert McMillan or Ruffin Bailey or some of the greats of the Wake County Bar. Now, of course, I've been gone for 12 years, or 13, but now I'm sure it's not the same, though the Wake County Bar, having gone to other bars, either to try a case, or in my case, I was president of the North Carolina State Bar, and we made a point of going around to the various district bars, and every bar has its own different character. You can even tell that, oddly enough, just going to a calendar call, and just how collegial the lawyers in the group are. In Wake County, in my day at least, and I can't, like I say, speak for today, but the lawyers were all so collegial. And it made practicing law more fun and more interesting, and I think more in keeping with all our professionalism code and creed.
And describe that. You talked about what it meant for you to be part of the bar and the bar association. What would you tell someone else about that? Or someone who's coming up in law about the benefits to you of being part of the bar or association?
Well, being part of the bar, I was a member for years of the bar association, but my big association was with the state bar. And I think a lot of people are intimidated by the state bar. They shouldn't be. It's actually an organization that is clearly there to protect the public, but is also very user-friendly for lawyers. They provide all sorts of assistance to lawyers. They provide assistance to clients. In my career, I was able to serve in a lot of different capacities. I was on the Disciplinary Hearing Commission, which was the first time I had to announce to a lawyer that he was being disbarred. I could almost not find my voice. It was a sad experience. And to see what can happen to lawyers when they don't have the help that they need or whatever they needed that would have made them able to succeed. Sometimes it was just a case of mental illness. But the Client Security Fund, I was on the Client Security Fund board for a number of years, and I always laugh and say that's the best gig ever, because people who have been cheated or their lawyer has defalcated, they can come to the Client Security Fund and recoup some of the losses. And the looks on the people's faces when they realize that the bar really does protect people. And to get involved in something like that, I think, would enrich anybody's legal career. And I think that likewise, being involved in the activities of the Bar Association, as I say, some of the folks who came before the State Bar, the Grievance Committee, clearly didn't have what they needed to help them when they had rough spots in their career, or even when they were experiencing health issues or mental health issues. Both the State Bar and the Bar Association provide that kind of help. And if people will take advantage of that, they will be enriched. Even if they're not helping themselves directly, they're helping themselves indirectly by helping other people. And I think that's, by the way, one of the things that distinguishes lawyers, because lawyers have a high incidence of substance abuse and mental health problems. But there is the lawyer assistance program, and the key to that, and it's a little bit, I guess, like AA, because you have meetings, whatever, but with the lawyer assistance program, you have other lawyers who have had the same problems that you have sometimes, or have family members who've had those problems. And because of that kind of knowledgeable support, there's a higher incidence of people being able to put things back together.
Looking back over your career in the Attorney General's office, with the bar, with the State Bar, with the Bar Association, what moment sticks out as your proudest?
Well, I had wonderful clients. In fact, I had one client was vocational rehabilitation, and they have, books full of rules about, who they can help and under what circumstances. But I remember one case where they had a client that they could help. In fact, what he wanted was a van. He was a quadriplegic, and he wanted a van he could drive. And technology had improved. It's kind of a scary thought, but had improved to the point that this man who could barely move his hands and couldn't move his feet at all could drive this heavy van, and he wanted vocational rehabilitation to pay for it. They said they would pay for the van or the modifications, which were about equal cost, but they couldn't do both because of an economic needs test, because both he and his wife both had fairly good jobs. But he wasn't satisfied with that and took it all the way to the Fourth Circuit, and the Fourth Circuit said we were right, we didn't have to pay for anything. And we came back, and came back to Raleigh. About 6 weeks later, I got a call from the man's lawyer, and he said, Ann, do you remember when you said that your client would pay for either the van or the modifications? Do you think they might still consider doing that? And I said, well, I'll ask them. But I knew what the answer was, and of course, they paid for the van. And when you have clients like that, practicing law is an honor and a privilege, and so my career was the kind of career that I had. And let me say another favorite story that I like to tell people concerns a woman who's now one of my dearest friends, but at the time I'd never laid eyes on her, and one of the jobs that we had in the Attorney General's office was writing criminal appellate briefs. We always represented the state once a case was appealed from the Superior Court level. And, of course, there were deadlines for filing our briefs. And apparently, on one occasion, I miscalculated the due date for my brief. I filed it one day late. And my opposing counsel, who worked for the public defender, called me and she said, Ann, you filed your brief late. And I said, oh, my word, I had no idea. And she said, well, if you don't fix this, they will dismiss your brief. And then she proceeded to tell me how to fix it. And like I say, I had never laid eyes on that woman before, and now she's one of my dearest friends. And that's a tribute to the legal profession, because, not doing that, and she wouldn't have been penalized, I would have been, and the state would have been, and that really is not the way the system is supposed to work. That's not consistent with the creed that we read. It doesn't help the court, it doesn't help the public.
It's collegiality. That's wonderful.
Yes.
So tell us, I want to ask you about the importance of mentorship in your career. So like when you were a new attorney, having a mentor, and then further along in your career as you were reaching behind you to other lawyers coming up, tell us about the importance of mentorship relationships for lawyers.
Well, I think it's important for everybody. I think for a young woman, particularly in 1971, it was important for a lot of different reasons. And I never asked anybody to be my mentor, but Judge Sid Eagles just sort of stepped in and became my mentor. And when opportunities came up, because he was a lot farther along, he'd been in the Attorney General's office a lot more years than I had, and opportunities came along, and he put me in line for those opportunities. And I had other people who helped me in my career, Andy Venori, and with the state bar even. I had a friend, now deceased, Bill King. I never would have been president of the state bar had it not been for Bill King making me head of the grievance committee and then recommending me to be president of the state bar, because a woman had never, and a public sector attorney, had never served as president of the state bar. But had it not been for those mentors, neither of whom did I ever ask to be my mentor, but they both did. And so I tried to provide some of that same assistance to the folks. And of course, I was a manager, so I had folks whose careers, opportunities were I was directly responsible for. But I tried to help others too, because I think we're all better off when we do that.
And when you, looking at law students graduating from UNC now, or coming to the swearing in and seeing these young attorneys being sworn in Wake County, and when you see that, what goes through your heart?
Oh, lots of things. I wish them well. I think that practicing law now is a lot harder, because in the 70s and well, even later than that, the practice of law was the rails surrounding protecting the lines between what lawyers do and what paraprofessionals do were much more clearly defined, and that now with the internet, everything has changed. I mean, it's not just the legal practice. I think every time I go to see my doctor and I've looked up something, I've Googled something, some medicine or some condition or whatever, I think that things have dramatically changed, and I hope that it works out well for these folks. So far, so good.
And
well, let me back up. I think one thing that's very noticeable is social media, which has had such a dramatic effect on all of our lives. Like me forgetting my phone this morning, and I'm lost without my phone. But you have. First we used emails, and now I hardly even have to make myself check my email. I'm going to text message because it's just like that. And I think somehow we changed our expectations for, I'll get back to you in a few days, and now we expect somebody to get back to us instantaneously with our answer if we can't find it ourselves. And that's a very dramatic change.
And yeah, would lend itself to stress for sure. It's particularly if practicing law. But through the years, how did you manage the caseload? How did you manage things? What helped you the most?
What helped me the most was wonderful clients and wonderful colleagues, and I have the most supportive husband. He is a lawyer. In fact, he's just turned 80 this past weekend, and he's still practicing law. I had to retire, and the reason I retired was that I had a mother who was in hospice, and I had a 4-month-old granddaughter, and I was in a position that I couldn't do part-time. It just wouldn't have worked. It was, the kind of fire department job. You just had to be there, and there was no telecommuting then, so I just had to retire. He doesn't, and he's not, and he still likes what he does. But I've forgotten what you asked.
So how did you manage?
Oh, okay. Well, yeah, I was talking about my husband. He's so supportive. He never, in all of those 39 years, he never put his career, even though he was with a high-powered law firm and I was with the government, he never put his career ahead of my career. And he, in the sense that he didn't put it ahead of it, but he also assumed assumed parental responsibility for our 2 girls. In fact, our younger daughter would call him when she had a French test, and he'd be at his office some nights. He'd call her and say, "I've got a test tomorrow." He'd come home from his office to read those French words to her. No reason I couldn't have, but that was what her father did. So, with that kind of support, you can make it work. I don't know that it would have worked with both of us trying to build 2,000 hours in a year, but my hours were much more manageable as a government lawyer.
What about outside the law? What outside the law in your life helped you through the years?
Oh, I have wonderful friends. In fact, I have a group of 8 who all work for the state, and we're all state retirees, and we all continue to support each other. But I had organizations. I did volunteer work for different organizations that I supported and still support. And I think that doing that is part of what lawyers need to do. I mean, it gets you out of yourself and thinking about other things and how you can be a part of your community and help your community.
And what is your advice to these new attorneys who are starting out?
Advice to them? Well, I think that they should get out and do things. They need to remember that creed and take it seriously. And if they can look around at other lawyers that they admire, think about the reasons they admire those lawyers, and if any of those lawyers are able or willing to serve as mentors. Maybe, as I say, I never ask, but maybe the time has come that we do need to ask, and don't be afraid to ask or to ask for help. Don't ever be afraid to ask for help. The stupid question is the question you don't ask.
And for these centennial videos, for people in the Wake County Bar, who else should we interview for these?
Who else
should we interview for this series?
Well, I mean, you bring up these young lawyers. Why don't you interview some of them?
Well, that's my next question. So in 20 years, for the 120th anniversary, looking back at their careers, who am I interviewing then?
Well, I don't know. I remember when I was president of the bar and I had to do those quarterly articles, trying to figure out, what am I going to say? And especially as a public sector lawyer in my career, and I was a manager, so I wasn't mostly doing representing clients. So what did I have to say to people? And I remember Tom Lunsford, who was executive director of the state bar then, said, well, talk to some of the young lawyers and find out what they think. And I did, and I was surprised because what they thought was so different and I will be specific here, because when I graduated as a woman, we were confronted by judges and other lawyers who thought that if a child sneezed, we'd stay home and mess up the court calendar or whatever. And you couldn't even think about taking time off to go to a school play when your child was in 4-year-old kindergarten, and talk to these young women, and their attitudes were totally different. And it was a shock because I just somehow had no idea. So I think it would be interesting 20 years from now to talk to the ones now, and then 20 years from now, see how that's changed, because it really does. And even, you're not aware of it because you're doing your thing and not necessarily paying that much attention to what everybody else is doing.